Derek Gedal Chiastov Virkin Fosher Ulkayer agus Akahorahe Bawali Mowikas Fane and Gawal, Dusna Tridal Counter Quiritum Chirp, this couple piece of Ama Akaha View. It's a very great pleasure to be here, to have accepted the invitation of three constituencies, Dublin South West, Dublin South Central and Dublin Midwest, to be with you. And I'm so pleased, so early on in this campaign with 3 months to go, that I have an opportunity of addressing you all. Could I just say in the very beginning that the party of which I have the honour to be president, the Labour Party, is a party that is an international party, not just in name, but sometimes also, above all else, it's in solidarity with sister parties all over the world. And our great, great friends in the Norwegian Labour Party, and particularly its youth movement, have suffered an incredible tragedy recently. And I have to say, you know, as I come through these doors, many of the people who are nearer to my own age will forgive me if I don't say, I regard Labour Youth as the leaven of the Labour Party. They continually renew the Labour Party and so on. But they in particular, it was their sister party, the Labour Youth, who were in fact meeting in the annual summer camp, that have suffered the greater brunt of the tragedy that has taken place. And for that reason, I would ask, before we begin and before I say anything, that we would stand for 1 minute in silence in solidarity with our Norwegian comrades and friends. Thank you. And I think we must all be impressed at the world leadership of the Norwegian Prime Minister, and particularly the head of their youth organisation, who said that their response to this action would be to deepen their commitment to peace and to also extend their commitment to democracy. It's a headline, if you like, in response to acts of terrorism. And this afternoon, I visited with the head of Labour Youth and their women's office and a number of other deputies. I visited the Norwegian embassy to sign the book and to convey on behalf, I'm sure, of all members of the party and the Irish people, indeed, our deepest sympathy. Now, it's a great pleasure to be at a meeting at which there are representatives of three constituencies, and so many people who have come to hear what I have to say, to some extent in the short amount of time I will have, who are outside of the Labour Party. I am very conscious of the fact that the Labour Party has put me into the field as their candidate. It was a great honour, and indeed it was also a great relief too, after spending 9 months in an internal contest. But I was delighted to be chosen and privileged and honoured to have to be the candidate of the Labour Party. But I realise too, of course, that I hope to be a precedent for all of the people. Agus os rudé go bhfuil raidir na lithe géiste lam laura mé néilge tar éis piasa chun béidir iad sanna bhfuil símachas an créitú goach seansach go bhfuil ghlistar le tréban an céad teannas an tíir seo. I want to say as well that it would be very disingenuous of me if I didn't say that it's great to be in a room that has in fact elected 6 Labour deputies and a string of Labour councillors. So many who have come through, as I said, the vital education process of having worked in Labour Youth. One of the most moving things in my own experience about going to Labour Party conferences and speaking over the years on different aspects of, you know, where we were as a country, where we might go as a country, of Labour's particular proposals and its values, has been the Tom Johnson School, where actually I have addressed every single year. And I think what's great about that is that they weren't just listening to ideas, but they came back and worked with others to actually turn their beliefs into practical wins and gains for the Labour Party on local authorities. And I'm honoured that we are here joined by the Mayor of South Dublin and ourselves, and indeed by the Deputy Mayor. I'm also very pleased to see my colleagues, former colleagues. Hard for me to get used to say that, but they remain my comrades, the deputies who are here, and also former people with whom I served. Well, I have to say as well, people have been asking me about my views on the horse racing industry, and they keep quoting Mary Upton and so forth. I keep telling them that her document on the subject is the definitive one, Mary, so and obviously it is. I think that you were invited here to hear, if you like, the kind of campaign that I am running for the presidency, and that campaign has begun. I have summarised the campaign by saying that we have to think about building an Ireland that is different from that from which we are just now emerging. It is important to be truthful. I think that candidates, when they stand for the presidency, must ask a number of questions rather straightforwardly. Do you want to go back to that radical, selfish society from which we are emerging for the last 15 years? Do you believe we should recover to it? I answer unequivocally that we should not. We have to speak about replacing that version of society by really three major components, I think. A radically inclusive citizenship. And that's not just on paper. It means reforming institutions, reforming the way that we speak to each other, reforming consciousness. A radical inclusive citizenship in a creative society that, yes, will have different obvious manifestations in forms of the arts and culture, but I'm talking about creativity in everything we do. Creativity in the way we look after those who are dependent on us, creativity in trade, creativity in peacekeeping, creativity in diplomacy, creativity in entrepreneurship, and so on. And then the third thing, in building a real republic. I believe that the kind of republic for which we began struggling at the end of the 19th century, and which was promised in 1913 at the time of the lockout, or in the democratic programme, or indeed in the 1916 declaration, was a republic that has not emerged. In my very final speech after 25 years in the Dáil, I spoke about restoring the prospect of a real republic and building it. And in that sense, it has to be one that is radically accepts the fundamental dignity of every citizen, irrespective of their gender, irrespective of their orientation, of their capacity, or indeed of their means. Remember then that what I'm speaking about now, say a few words about it in a moment, is so different from that from which we have come. That from which we have come is one where you are defined as an important and valuable person in terms of the property you owned. And indeed that property itself had an artificial value put on it. So we got to a point where people in a republic admired those who were making vast speculative profits from effectively nothing productive at all. At the same time, with a superficial version of economic growth, so many people were left excluded, be it in terms of housing, education, health, and so on. So I think this evening, and as I go all around the country, I want to speak positively. We must get beyond recrimination. Yes, it is important that those who are responsible by commission or omission should not enjoy some kind of impunity from their actions. But having recognised that, it's important now to move on. And moving on means that we must be willing to actually make the language mean something. And if we are to do that, I think that the changes, I'm going to the McGill School in 2 days' time. I think tomorrow, Friday, I'm speaking there. The theme of their conference is Transforming Ireland. Well, if Ireland is to be transformed, just think about it. Does this mean that some few experts will draw up a blueprint for Ireland and sit down without meeting very many people and suggest that this is our way forward? I suggest that the transformation of Ireland has already begun in many different communities, and there are many of them represented here. For example, the kind of inclusive citizenship that I'm speaking about exists in those, for example, who have been responsible for the St Andrews Resource Centre in Rialto, for those who have been responsible for Uncosson, for those who have been responsible for the Women's Way to Work programme in Ballyfermot. I could go on. These are the stirrings, these are the seeds upon which the transformation of Ireland should begin. Now, if you identify that as the real way forward, think about it again. What these actions that have been of so great value, what they say something very radical, and that is that there are no ideas too complicated for what are called ordinary people to understand. It is not an action of rare expertise to want a democratic community, a democratic society, or to allow everybody to participate in terms of their capacity. There is nothing too complex for our citizens to understand. When I was introduced by Dermot in many cases, sometimes what he said about my biography, I get tired reading it myself, and indeed I was hoping that in the book, my book from last week, that I won't have to go back to it again for a while. But I recall one of the things that, for example, before I read any theoretical work on the obvious values of, for example, of socialism, I had the experience of bad housing, of losing our house, of being reared by some other than my parents, and so on. I think it is important that we realise that everything is possible. At the age of 19, I worked as a grade 8 clerk in Galway. People mention that I was at Galway University in Diana and Manchester. Before that, I began in a factory, then I went to the ESB, and then I went to England, and then I came back and I got scholarships. But it would have been an outrageous act on my part if I turned my back on my experience. The fact of the matter is, this is the point. Most people in my circumstance sought education to escape from their circumstances. But there is a responsibility in all of us who had that experience. Mary, for example, Mary Upton, who enjoys a professorship, a distinguished scholar, came back and worked in our constituency. It's what we do. That is those of us who want to turn our values into practical benefit. I don't want to say much more than about that, because I have written about this experience, but the reason I do so is to say that I value education. Could there be anything more important than those voluntary organisations who gave women excluded from formal education the chance to come back into education? Could there be anything more important than those who give their nights and their days and their weekends to helping other people to go back to continuing our lifelong education? Or the thousands of people who provide facilities in sports and elsewhere for people so as to help young people? Or other people who simply are available to listen? Now, our society, in the Republic it was not created, allowed a speculative, radical individualism to destroy this country's reputation and bring us to our knees. That must be replaced by a radical inclusion in which we value every citizen in terms of their fundamental dignity, and as President I can speak about that. I think as well as that, I'm sometimes asked, but can the President do anything? Well, the President's powers are contained really in 3 articles in the Constitution, Articles 12, 13 and 14. In another life I used to lecture about this. But one of the things that are there, yes, you have a constitutional obligation as President. Yes, you have ceremonial duties to fulfill as President. And yes, you must fulfill those with dignity, realising that you represent not yourself, but the people of Ireland at home and abroad. But the third area is where you exercise your discretion. And that was what was powerfully invoked by Mary Robinson when she started. It is about the topics that you choose to address. For example, government of the day will deal with pressing issues that are contained in legislation, or as you go from one budget to another. The issue of poverty and exclusion is a broad theme, wider than any particular topic, and it's also stretched wider in time. Issues of the kind of Europe we want to create, one of competing economic nationalisms, or a Europe beyond war, which might in fact be a place of social guarantee in a global economy. Again, in relation to how do we restore trust in our institutions when so many have forfeited trust. I could go on. And I have made practical proposals that when I am president, yes, I will support the Convention on the Constitution which will take place, and I welcome it. I would like to be able to nominate a couple of people to it. But whether or not I intend to run a series of presidential seminars drawing on best intelligence at home and abroad to address these wider issues. That is the president that you elect exercising discretion with a very positive agenda based on values. And that is what I am proposing. I also want to say that the interesting side for me is that I don't have to invent a new program. Sometimes people say, you know, we want a slogan or we want some kind of identification of the brand. People know what Michael D Higgins stands for. And people also know the independence of mind that I brought within my own party, and indeed the people, the groups all over the country that I've spoken to. In 1969, when I was 28 and appointed as a young lecturer, we had a discussion in University College Go, where some of the older academics said about our adult education proposals, is this something a university should be doing? And a number of us younger people taught those courses from Ennis in the south up as far as Letterkenny and over in the east as far as Athlone, because it was offering an opportunity of coming back to education to people. Therefore, frankly, when I speak about inclusion in education, or inclusion in housing, or the right to be treated equally in relation to health, I don't have to invent a program suitable to bring me now as far as the end of October. I am talking about the testament of my life. It was in the 1970s when I sat next to Mary Robinson that I remember the first bill I drafted ever was one that would have abolished the status of illegitimacy. That bill was described by a very senior Fine Gael senator at the time as Michael D's proposal for socialism under the sheets. And the idea was that you couldn't in fact abolish illegitimacy because you'd put the big farm in meat or something under threat. And I went through all those referendums, every one of them, when we saw this right to civil divorce, the right to all of these things, the right of women, etc. They didn't drop out of the sky. There was a price to be paid for standing for all of these issues. And sometimes you had to drag people with you. And some of us, like for example Jim Kelly and myself, in the 1980s, were willing to pay the price of losing our seats because we took a stand on some of these issues. So I'm not inventing something new. I am coming to all of you, my dear friends, colleagues and comrades, and asking you to be with me in this drive for the presidency. And over the next 7 years, I will be going to every part of Ireland, talking about this new republic, and talking in a very practical way. I've said about what I mean by a radically inclusive citizenship. I'd like to say what I mean in a creative society. I didn't just speak about that. When I was Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht, between 1993 and 1997, the expenditure on the film industry went from 11 million to 187 million. I know, for example, the change it made in Ballyfermot and the animation school, the question of the rock school, about all those things, those wonderful young people who were able to play, who were able to turn their music into a satisfying way of life. And music and the arts were only one part of it. There are lots of other things we can do. We can just move past all those old excluding bureaucracies by being creative in the way we speak to each other. If you are in an office or if you are holding a particular position, there is a different way of looking at the person sitting across from you as a person who is a fellow human, who is you radically accept their dignity. Supposing you can do nothing, at least you can listen. That is a very radical thing in our society. We must take away all those barriers, and we can do it. We can be creative as well. There are people who are responding to their unemployment position by doing new things and applying new skills. I go to Bloom, for example, and I see the people who have come back and they are making different things and they need assistance and encouragement, and I will be with them. When I go to, and I see, for example, one of the most encouraging things here is what is possible in the agricultural sector when I visited the ploughing championship. But in agriculture, it is encouraging to know that our agribusiness is up there in the top 10 in the world. So therefore, let us think as citizens and in a real republic, and want our island to be free of genetically modified products, for example, and become something that is regarded as having provided wonderful opportunities all over Europe. I also think of something that is when I said about the creative society. This isn't something that's provided out of surplus. I often am asked to read papers because I was indeed a minister who funded the film industry, creative opportunities in music. And you know, sometimes people say, well, the total value in the creative industries globally is about 442 billion. Yes, the growth rate in Europe is 8.7%, 5 million people in Europe work in the creative industries. But people forget that much of that activity is monopolised. One company with 80% of all of the production in the games area, for example. And really the opportunities in the creative society come from creative communities. And that's why I began by pointing out to those places who are in fact working already in the communities in your constituencies. They are the seedbeds of creativity. Creative communities make the opportunities in the creative economy possible, sustainable and real. And they democratically distribute all of the opportunities. And again, in times as we have, with unemployment now rising, and many of our young people immigrating, the importance of making social provision. I remember being suggested that I was an expensive minister, when I gave the funding for 14 theatres around this country, including the one in Tala. But look at what Tala has been successful. Look at the library that is next door to it. And is it not the case that it is at times of unemployment, at times when the other opportunities aren't there, that you actually need the libraries, you need the different public facilities. It's not a time for shrinking the public world. It's a time for extending the public world, removing the barriers and access to it. And you know, the other part of it then that is important is in relation to every year for the last 10 years. I've gone to England around just in the month of December to meet some small number now as they survive of those Irish who immigrated in the 1950s that are in Kilburn and Hammersmith and Haringey and all of those other places. Centres now threatened by the Tory policies in relation to some of these community centres. But being Irish, if our young Irish now are going again, it's important that they not be lost. It is important that we stay in touch with them, that we in fact turn this word diaspora into something by having tangible support for the connections with all of those who are Irish, who are living abroad, and who may now be immigrating. I think as well in relation to groups like Custom that I mentioned already, and to others, there are very interesting things that one can do. You know, I say this, sometimes I'm asked about, you know, why are you doing this at this stage, and so on. What it is, I cannot think of a better way of spending the next 7 years of my life. I am very moved by that statement the President makes when you take office. I will dedicate my abilities to the service and welfare of the people of Ireland. It's much stronger in Irish. That is what my father did. That's what my uncles did. My father did not have a republic delivered to him. Neither did his uncles or my aunts or any of my family. Neither did your parents or your grandparents. So out of this great darkness that has come about because of a version of the economy, its connection with society, and the kind of values that were in it, let's say goodbye to it and move on and build and create the real republic. Radical inclusive citizenship in a creative society. Building the real republic, proud to be Irish at home and inclusive, dealing with each other differently and warmly, playing to our strengths, celebrating the decencies that are there in all the communities that you represent. That's what this presidential election is going to be about. It's not about competition for strokes. It's not about saying what the president can do when you clearly cannot do it in the Constitution. I have said what I'm standing for. I have said how it can be accommodated in the Constitution. But more interestingly than anything like this, I also bring my vulnerability to you. I bring my vulnerability to you at this time. And I say to you, I honour all those people who represent these values I'm talking about, are ones you know in your heart. They are the voices speaking to you from your heart. This is not only a matter of making one rational choice to replace another. It is about listening to the language of the heart. It is about playing to the decency that are in Ireland. It is about drawing the best from tradition. It is about using your imagination and all of your faculties in the most powerful way. That's why it has been a privilege to be here with you so early on in this presidential campaign. And I'd like to express my gratitude to you for both coming and listening to me. Ní féidir le marró tábhacht agus atáise, an takeíocht atá méid fáil, an takeú atá méid fáil as úr bín in láthair a ná. Gur a míle maith agé, gur a míle maith.